Welcome. And I'm Richard Jorgensen. I'm with Dave Daubert, and delighted to have this opportunity for us to present with you today. And we're presenting today on a book that we've been working on throughout the summer. And it is called Becoming a Hybrid Church. This is something that's grown out of our experience working with leaders, with congregations. And it's also grown out of our desire to help all of us consider how we navigate this season and how we will live faithfully into a new time as church together. And Dave, you might want to say a few words.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. Thanks for the opportunity to serve with you, for your friendship and the leadership that you provide in your synod, and the opportunity that you and I have to share this. I'm so grateful for the partnership I share. And of course, many of the people in Lower Susquehanna Synod I've met over the years and had the privilege of working with. One thing I do want to say about this book and really this entire webinar is that we're really fellow learners. That's kind of a disclaimer here that we know what we're doing, sort of. And mostly we've learned by watching, and some of that's been watching people fall flat on their face and saying, oh, don't let that happen to you. Other things have been people who've done some amazing work and we've gone, wow, that is really cool, and other things in between. So as Richard and I share here, really here, we're going to try and be confident and tell you what we know, but really hear a humbleness in between the lines here, because, you know, really, for the most part, before Ash Wednesday, none of us knew what we were doing in this arena, except a few exceptions. And some of those are probably in the audience as part of this bishop's convocation. So there may be some of you who actually know more about this than we do. So we present this with that kind of attitude that we're all kind of fellow learners.
Yeah, and I would say a deep word, first of all, Dave, appreciation to you and appreciation to all of our congregations where we're serving, because I've learned a great deal from all of you, and I'm grateful that we're in this ministry together. And in St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, he writes, I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. And we continue to live with that confidence that God has really begun a good work among us, that we are in the midst of that work, and God is still working for our good. And we trust God, and we trust the goodness of God.
Absolutely.
And I'd invite us to pray. Gracious God, thank you that you have made us your own, that you continue to work for our good in this season. Guide us and use us as you will, and inspire us in this time to listen for your voice amidst our voices, that you continue to make of us a new creation. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Richard. Whoops.
And if anyone had really suggested on Ash Wednesday of 2020 that by Easter Sunday our buildings would be closed, and yet more people would hear the gospel in a single day than ever before in human history, we would not have believed them. And yet that is exactly what happened. Now, I will add, Easter was not canceled and our churches were not closed. But what happened is we were out of our buildings and we were faced with a new challenge. And in the midst of that, there were people who were curious. How is the church going to do this? What's going to happen on Easter? And will worship really take place? Well, in fact, it did. And we were doing some trial and error, but remarkably, we were up, we were running, we were preaching, we were worshiping, and people were listening, and they heard the gospel. And the great news is that we really did it, and we did it to the glory of God.
No, I know that it's just amazing, Richard, when you think about how many people actually watched Easter services and heard Easter preaching online. The statistics seem to point to the fact that in some ways it was the most impactful Easter in history, besides the original one, of course, which triggered all the rest. But we really could never have imagined what was going to happen if we had thought otherwise.
Yeah, and some of the season has been about that we haven't had a choice oftentimes. Well, there is always a choice. We can change or we can die. And sometimes people do choose to die versus the option of change. But the beauty of this is that many of us discovered that we had an urgency, we had to do something, and we found a way to do it. Now, the beauty of the first days of the pandemic is that people many times were surprised that we could do it. And people often celebrated that we were capable, and they said, wow, our leaders are smart. The challenge came later when it seemed like there were multiple choices and multiple options. And suddenly we found that we weren't always of one heart, one mind. And there really is a big difference between responding to a crisis, and it's quite another thing to live into a new reality. And when we started, we thought it was a short-term crisis. In fact, we're living into a new way of being church. And in fact, I would say God is calling us to be a new kind of church. And we're going to look different in the future. And the gospel is still the gospel. God is still God. We still have many of the same calls to make disciples, to bear witness. But what happens in our on-the-ground worship, in our buildings, in our neighborhoods, is going to look different. We're discovering new potential for online ministry. And I will add, online ministry is not virtual. If we could cut down on the word virtual, because it's real ministry with real people.
Yeah, Rich, I think that's really important to remind people that when you had a phone call before the pandemic, you didn't say I had a virtual call. You just say I talked to somebody. We've accepted that technology so long that we know that on the phone we have real conversations. But we're still getting used to the idea that now that we can see each other, which is actually a step better, that this is still somehow a pretend kind of a place. And I think that's just so important for people to internalize. Real ministry happens online. Real interactions happen online. Real relationships happen online. Online is in many ways its own real place. And if we can internalize that, it'll really help us be a hybrid church. In fact, if you can't internalize that, you probably can't make the step to being a hybrid church, because you have to take it as legitimately what you do there is what you do in the previous environment and a physical thing. And of course, we'll continue to do physical ministry too.
Yeah, and both have their place and both have the same call that we are to make disciples, we are to bear witness, and we're to love God, we're to love one another.
No, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I think is really important, in some ways, 2020 was just sort of a scramble, wasn't it? If you're watching this and paying attention to this and you're a leader in the church, you know that a big part of 2020 was just scrambling. And Thom Rainer just put this blog out literally a few days ago. And he said, really, we should be thinking about 2021 as a new base year for your church. That if you're going to think about your congregation, and in my congregation, our council met last Monday, we're thinking about budget, and we're thinking about changing staffing, adding tech persons, changing job descriptions, adding money in categories we never had before, moving money from categories to be different. You should really be thinking about, okay, 2020, we were trying to figure out how to get through this. 2021, we sort of have a fresh start on almost everything if we want it. How can I make it a new base church as a leader? How can I work with the leaders in my congregation to make it a base church and cultivate an imagination? If we were going to build a church for the new world in which we know we're going to be living, what kinds of things would we do? Because in many ways, we've got the freedom to start from scratch. And that means we've got to be thinking transformationally, adaptively, in a whole new set of ways. And that's true for every one of us. The beautiful thing about the pandemic, and there aren't very many beautiful things about a pandemic. I mean, it's been a horrific mess, and it looks like we're entering another spike, at least where I live and maybe where you are as well. But this is far from over, and it's going to involve a lot more tragedy and a lot more pain and a lot more of all sorts of horrific things. But the one thing that it really does is it puts us all in the same place. I think we have more chance to be compassionate, to be more sympathetic, to work together, because in many ways, it's not like, oh, the big church, they got this, and oh, the little church has that, and oh, the church in the city's got that, but the church in the country has that. No, actually, we all have a pandemic, and while we all have different things to do with, we're actually all scrambling, we're all learning. There's a real opportunity for us to think about church differently, and that even means the together part of church, the cooperative, collaborative things. It's been a real equalizer in terms of how things function. So it's going to be adaptive time for all of us. And I hope we really all do seize the opportunity to help each other and learn from each other and support each other as we go through this. I want to talk a little bit about adaptive leadership processes. Adaptive leadership is really about engaging reality with the goal of transforming. So you have to really pay attention to what's going on, and you have to interpret it. You have to put some sort of lens on it, give yourself a paradigm or a way of making sense of it. And then when you've made sense of it, then you can say, okay, based on how I understand this at a deeper level, I can make these kind of actions happen, these kind of interventions. So you watch and you think about it and you interpret it, and eventually you decide we're going to do this, and you act. In many ways, you act based on some understanding, but then you have to watch again because it's a lot of experimentation. So you re-observe, did it work? Did we understand it correctly? Were there things we didn't? You're constantly learning and interpreting and intervening. It's kind of a way of being in the world. And adaptive leadership is a pretty new term. Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky coined it in like 2009, but it's a framework. It's a leadership framework, and it helps us adapt and thrive in challenging environments. And if there's anything about the pandemic, it's challenging, and in some awful ways that are painful, but in some ways that will accelerate the changes that we would have had to do anyway. And if we do it well, the church we have could be quite amazing in the process. So I want to see these 4 keys as adaptive leadership pieces, and I think they're important. Number 1, adaptive leadership is grounded in character. People have to trust you, because people don't risk, they don't share, they don't do anything else if they don't trust you. If you don't tell the truth, if you don't treat them with integrity, if you don't apologize when you mess up, if you don't have the character and the honesty to respect people, the whole thing falls apart. Grounded in that then is organizational justice, where people know that they can trust you, and so they actually will come to you and share ideas. It doesn't matter whether they're the pastor or the council president, or it's a maintenance person or a person in a particular group, an active person who's been there for 60 years or a newer person who's just kind of testing things out. There's a real sense that everybody's voice and everybody's person matters. Then you take what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you're sensing from across the board with people, and you develop an organization that's a learning organization. And you learn from hearing, you learn from observation, you learn from trying things. You fall flat on your face and you say, well, why did that fail? Not bang, shame on you. But okay, what did we learn? And that requires a certain degree of resilience, emotional intelligence, where instead of freaking out when things don't go well, we're able to work through it, to support one another, to learn without panicking, and to maintain some sense of stability emotionally. Not that emotions don't matter, but that the emotions that we feel are processed in healthy ways, and then we move through them and even learn from those emotions what it is that's going on so that we can do this. So these 4 keys are essential, and without them, and I would just reiterate character again. For those of us who are key leaders in a system, your character and my character, can people trust us? Do people trust us? It is really the foundational place where everything else does or doesn't fall in adaptive leadership.
And I know you're going to speak about it later. The piece on this that's so essential also is our capacity to be gracious with each other.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that more. But yeah, when you fall flat on your face, that's part of emotional intelligence. Emotionally immature people, when things go wrong, they blame, they beat up, they deflect. And emotionally mature people kind of live in what is, and process and deal with it in healthy ways. Absolutely, Richard. I think that's really important. And we'll say it again later. You're right. But it's actually the kind of thing that it doesn't hurt to be reminded more than once. We are gospel people. We are gracious with each other. We're not always going to say the right words. We're not always going to think the first idea won't be the best. We're not always going to respond. But if we don't follow up at some point with grace, we sort of deny the whole reality of who we are. And that includes, Richard and I. When you're listening to this presentation, please be gracious with us, because we're probably going to say some things wrong and botch things up. We all need grace together. On the other hand, technical changes are a little different. They're more straightforward. Somebody who's an expert and understands how the system currently works well. Maybe your Wi-Fi goes down, and instead of just saying, well, let's see if we can figure out what's going on, you get somebody who understands Wi-Fi, tests it out, gets a new router, replugs in a cable, reboots something, whatever it is, and gets things back operating. And if people are really good at this, they can make it operate not just the way it was, but better. So it's not that technical things are bad, but that they matter. And so this final little piece on this section that we really want to talk about is it's not technical versus adaptive like it's a contest. But the real key is technical or adaptive is a question. What kind of problem are you facing? And recognizing that. And then if the issue is about fixing or improving something from where it's at, you're probably dealing with a technical solution. Put the expertise in the right place, ask the questions to diagnose it or improve it, and then make the action happen. But if it's about, wow, this is totally new, and we should be thinking more of these, not less, then it's a more deeper systemic, we need creativity kind of thing, then you're dealing with adaptive leadership. And the key for leaders is to recognize, am I dealing with a technical problem or an adaptive issue? And if it's a technical one, get the right people. If it's adaptive, start the right processes and thinking. And also don't forget, when you do adaptive change, every adaptive change is going to shift the system. It takes a lot of communication, a lot of caring, a lot of processing, because people will still be watching many things from the old system. They won't understand it. So that takes a lot of work. At the same time, every time you decide what to do, eventually you have to do it. Every solution, including adaptive, has technical things. Eventually, if you change how you organize, you're going to create governance, and you're going to create processes and whatever those things are. So always be asking the question underneath, why? Okay, why are we doing this? And when you understand why you're doing it, it'll help you determine whether it's technical or adaptive. It will also help people go deep enough to do good ministry. Because in the end, good ministry isn't just something that's implemented, it's actually understood. We don't just do something, we do things on purpose, and we think about why we do it from God's perspective, from a sense of mission, from a sense of commitment, from a sense of purpose, from the values we share. All those things have to be lived out.
Yeah, and we do it with a sense of purpose and always with an eye on the relationships, our relationship with God and with each other, and that these are always grounded in love.
Yeah, and Richard, actually, if you talk about this slide here, I think is really important. I think, Richard, you should probably maybe share about this, because I think it's what you're talking about right here.
Yeah, and I think some of the things that I would encourage us to remember is that allow space for creativity. We ought to do experiments. If you do an experiment and you know how it's going to turn out, it's not really an experiment. So this is a great time to try new things. And it's a great time to change our language. Because we might fail in an experiment, but did we really? Or did we learn? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the piece. The other thing I want to say is that when we try new things, we will feel awkward sometimes. And if we are doing ministry in such a way that we never feel awkward, then we probably aren't doing what we should be doing. Because
Bob Logan, he likes to say, if you don't feel awkward doing something new, you're probably not doing something new.
Yeah, and I think that awkward space is that space where we're learning. And it's sometimes such a gift to be there. And again, I would just say it's always so important, and I know, Dave, you will as well, that we practice grace, that we practice compassion, we practice mercy with each other. If we're grounded in the character of who we are as people of God, and we really are, then this is really essential to who we are. And it's just a new way for us to be church together.
You bet. Well, as we finish this section, Richard, we've got some questions here, and I hope the people who are listening and sharing this with us today will just take a few moments to reflect, maybe a little space, reflect on what Richard and I just talked about. What caught your attention or maybe made you say, aha? What did we say, if anything, that you found kind of challenging? And then out of that, really think about what ideas come to mind for what you'd consider in the setting where you serve. Are people adaptive? Do they need help? Is it a learning environment? Do they need help? Is it a place where people are gracious with each other? Do they need help? To begin to think about those issues, because the post-COVID church is going to have to try a lot of things, and being adaptive, being competent, being gracious, learning, all those things are going to be critical. So we're going to pause this, just leave you some space for a few minutes.
And then you may want to take some notes that you may want to bring to the question and answer time.
Absolutely. That's a great suggestion, Richard, that when we come back, bring your notes, because it may be in the Q&A, which Richard and I will have live after this. You've got some great ideas. I think that's really helpful. And then we'll see you back in a few minutes, hopefully with your notebooks going and some thoughts and things. And especially in the Q&A, I think if you bring some things, it may be that Richard and I learned a lot of things too. So thanks. We'll be back with you in a little bit.
Be blessed.